Hello, strugglers! Glad to see you all again nearly 5 months after we all congregated together at the altar of Kentaro Miura's Berserk. Chapter 372 is finally out, and it has exceeded all of our expectations. We've got all the hallmarks of this dark fantasy masterpiece present in it. We've got mystery, we've got intrigue, we've got action, and most importantly, we've got Casca. But our best girl is not exactly in the best shape from the look of things. Yes, Casca is alive and so far unspoilt, but it's clear that there's something different about her. And Griffith, well, he's up to his usual Griffith stuff, which is plotting the next move in his global conquest. We get answers in this chapter, yes, but they end up leaving us with more questions, which is why we love Berserk in the first place. So, without further ado, this is Berserk Chapter 372, Explored. Casca is safe from physical harm, but it's clear that she's completely out of it. The branded girl in Falconia. Many in the Berserk fandom had speculated as to where the story would pick up when it finally resumed. A lot of us thought that we'd go back to Guts on the boat, but instead, Studio Gaga chose to take us to Falconia through the perspective of a person who had just gotten her mind back, Casca. At the end of chapter 371, we saw Griffith arrive at Falconia's harbor with Zod and Casca in tow. The final panel of that chapter showed us Griffith's face adorned with a smile that just screamed, "Things are about to get a lot worse than you think they already are." And we don't know if it's causality or good storytelling, but we get exactly that in chapter 372. It opens with a POV shot of Casca reaching out towards a drowning Elfhelm as she thinks about Guts. When she was first kidnapped by Griffith, we were afraid she'd just lose her mind and revert to becoming Elaine again, but thankfully, our fears were unfounded. Casca regained consciousness, even if it was for a brief moment, during her flight away from Guts, and we heaved a breath of relief because she was still herself. Well, at least for the most part. Casca's final conscious thought was her thinking that Guts was disappearing into the distance, as we see the same whirlpool that was threatening to swallow the seahorse in chapter 371. But then something confusing happens. Casca wakes up. She's sleeping on a majestic bed in the middle of a room that looks like it was designed for royalty, but the roofing of this chamber reveals its real purpose. This was her new prison. As she steps onto the checkered floor beneath the cell-like ceiling, Casca looks like she's still half asleep, but then she thinks to herself that the vision of Guts was just a dream, and we're left baffled by her thought process here. We, as the audience, know that that was no dream. That was her conscious mind recalling what it desired the most. But now, when she had seemingly woken up, it felt like she was in a dream once more. Casca's eyes are glazed over for most of this chapter because it feels like she isn't in control of herself. She robotically goes about her day in Falconia, which suggests that she's been there at least for a few days. Her routine includes being fawned over by handmaidens, dressed up in falcon-themed ball gowns that are suspiciously crimson in color, and taking in the sights and people of the city of Falconia. If her dead eyes didn't tell us that she was in some kind of hypnotic trance here, the fact that she didn't protest to being put in a dress definitely did. In fact, Casca also doesn't speak for a large portion of this chapter, which once again cements her status as a prisoner in Falconia. She might be attended to like a princess and given access to a part of the castle grounds as well as Princess Charlotte's flower garden and orphans, but the moment Casca becomes trouble, she's surrounded by guards on all sides. The first proper hint that this was a Casca being forced into tranquility comes when she tears up at the sight of the new band of the Falcon marching near the Falcon's castle. Even though she's as docile as can be, Casca's eyes start leaking tears because this is obviously a huge emotional moment for her. She was a part of the band for many years and even led it towards its end. Her comrades died in the worst fashion possible during the eclipse, and she herself had never thought that she'd see that Falcon banner once again. Now that she did, it must have been bittersweet poison for the side of her brain that still remembered who she was. Casca is mesmerized by the grandeur of the World Spiral Tree, or the Helix Tree, as one of the handmaidens curiously calls it, but as soon as she's put in a setting where she can be reminded of her old self, things start getting out of control. After eating a splendid steak dinner as part of her daily routine in Falconia, Casca retires to her private bath for a relaxing soak, but as soon as she cups the water in her hands, she starts getting visions of Farnace and Shirke and the rest of her friends. Though Casca cannot understand why this is happening at the moment, we do. As Elaine, she spent a lot of her time being bathed by Farnace and being accompanied by Shirke during it. Bathing is an activity that she naturally associates with them, so when she cups the water in her hands, it reminds her of her days with them, kind of like muscle memory. This is what jerks Casca back into reality, sort of, and then she goes berserk on her captors. Casca smashes a vase in a dude's face, steals his sword, and then relieves him of his sword hand immediately, black swordsman style. She starts running away from the guards that had presumably been posted around her for this precise moment and thinks that she needs to get back to Guts. Casca thinks that if she doesn't reach him, then something terrible might happen to him, though her thoughts trail off here as the guards catch up to her. The final trio of panels depicting her time in Falconia show her drowsy, as if she'd just woken up from a dream and then slipping right back into it. Though we learned that Casca was safe from any harm in Falconia and that Griffith didn't exactly kidnap her to abuse her again, we have even more questions about her current mental state. It's clear that Casca is not regressing like she did during the eclipse. She retains her memories and her behavior is not reminiscent of Elaine. What isn't clear is which part of her stay in Falconia was reality and which part was a dream. Studio Gaga and Kujimori have done a fantastic job of giving us just enough context to keep us on our toes. Our best guess is that the only time Casca was actually dreaming was at the beginning of the chapter. The rest was all her, navigating through her hazy days as a captive in Falconia. She is being kept under the influence somehow, that much is evident. It could be the food she eats and the tea she drinks, because the emphasis on those two things in this chapter feels a little suspect, but it could also be thanks to Sonia's influence. She's the only known telepath in Falconia, and though she has only been shown to be able to read people's thoughts and communicate via thought transference, it's not entirely impossible for her to be able to keep someone permanently sedated with her abilities or implant false memories into their minds. What makes Sonia's involvement in this less likely are her morals, because though she is Team Griffith through and through, keeping someone under the influence like this just doesn't feel like her style of doing things. She's a brash teenager who would rather spit at your face than do it behind your back. This feels decidedly more Griffith, so it is possible that it's him using his god hand powers to influence Casca's mind like this. But while that is a question we'll eventually get an answer to, the more burning question is what in the world is Griffith going to do next? Because after destroying his biggest opposition to the west, Griffith now eyes the east. The perspective shifts to Falconia after we see Casca drift back into sleep, and Griffith is admiring the world spiral tree whilst being attended to by his top-ranking war demons. Grunbeld and Locus are here, Zod is lurking in the background, and Irvine returns with a status report that seems obvious at first, but is suspect upon second thought. He tells Griffith that the bird now dozes peacefully in her cage, and her flight is finally over. On first glance, it feels like he's talking about Casca because she just tried to escape a few pages back, and Irvine is one of Griffith's most trusted generals. Even though the soldiers that subdued Casca were human and not war demons, it makes sense that Griffith would have one of his apostles overseeing her ward in the Falcon's castle and not a human being. Apostles are instinctively subservient to the God Hand, whereas someone like Owen or Laban might call Griffith out for imprisoning Casca like this. But think back to chapter 371. Do you remember who Irvine was with in that chapter? That's right, he was at the harbor attending to Sonia. Mule, who is Sonia's usual bodyguard, was confused by Irvine's presence there as well, though he didn't say anything at the time. Then, when Griffith returned to Falconia with Casca, we saw Sonia get a momentary look of shock in her eyes before welcoming her leader back to his city. Sonia has already been likened to a bird in Berserk before. She is a kite and Shirke is an owl, if you guys recall chapter 246. Irvine's use of the bird and the fact that Berserk often likes to misdirect fans with its storytelling suggests to us that he might have been speaking about Sonia here, which could also be why Zod looks like he's grumpy about everything that's happened since he came back, because number one, he knows Casca, and number two, he might not approve of Griffith's treatment of his comrades. But there could be another reason to his seemingly dejected mood in this chapter, and that is Griffith's next objective, the East. So far in this story, we've only been traveling across the western half of humanity's continent, with the middle of all lands serving as its centerpiece. Even during the Kushan invasion, we never got to actually see their homeland, just their massive military might. Because Skellig Island was located at the westernmost point in Berserk's map, it makes sense that there might be another magical resistance to Griffith's rule forming in the easternmost extreme of this world. The Kushan's magic systems were a dynamic, Orient-inspired interpretation of Berserk's primary mode of arcana, so it's going to be interesting what kind of creatures reside in their lands. But more than that, going east has been teased since the first arc of Berserk. Way back in the days of the Black Swordsman arc, we learned that the Count received his behelit from a stranger who himself got it from a market in the East. There is some sort of mysterious connection between the behelits, the idea of evil, and the East, because the person who has been shown to have the most knowledge about the astral world that isn't Shirke is Daiba, and most of all, we suspect that the mysterious identities of both the Immortal One and his wretched foe might lie in the land where the sun rises. Many in the fandom have speculated that both Zod and Skull Knight, via Geiseric's trapped wraith, have their origins in the East, and we count ourselves among those people. We'll explain what we mean by this in another video, but for now, know that in his last interview ever, Kentaro Miura stated that he wanted to dive a bit more into Skull Knight's history, and now Griffith wants to go east. All this, and we haven't even spoken about Salat and his Bakiraka, who could also be the threat Griffith takes out next. He has been systematically destroying every creature and being that would be an obstacle to his ultimate vision for the world, and it makes sense that he would go after the Bakiraka given the fact that Rickard is with them and they just blew up one of his war demon captains in the middle of his city. There are a lot of possible branches that the story can decide to explore from this point onward, which is beautiful irony considering the chapter ends with a majestic shot of Griffith staring up at the world spiral tree. Marvelous verdict! Like we said at the beginning of this video, Berserk has a tendency to leave us with more questions than answers, and that's exactly what happened with chapter 372. Thankfully, we won't have to struggle for 5 more months for another chapter, as 373 is scheduled to drop on the 26th of May. We can't wait to see where the story goes from this point, because things are getting more interesting than we could have even imagined. But where do you think this story is going? And what did you think about the chapter itself? Let us know in the comment section below, and we'll see you in the next video.